Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're diving into a place you might not immediately think of when you picture Cold War tensions, eh?
Okay, I'm intrigued. Where are we headed?
Canada. We're going to use excerpts from Mr. Hutchings History podcast to uncover how Canada, this image of peacefulness, actually became a pretty major player during the Cold War.
I have to admit, that's not the first place my mind goes to for Cold War intrigue.
Right. But there were global power plays, a Nobel Peace Prize connection, and even some spy drama.
Okay, now you've got my attention.
It's a side of Canada we don't always hear about. So to really kick things off, we have to go back to World War II. Before 1939, Canada was, very much tied to Britain, a dominion, right?
Right, very much under Britain's wing.
But then the war effort, that really changed everything for them.
Oh, absolutely. By 1945, you're talking about a country with the world's fourth largest air force.
Wow, that's huge.
And the third largest navy.
That's incredible. I mean, Canada isn't exactly known for, military might.
No, not really. It's really remarkable when you think about it. But that's how much the war reshaped their global standing. And we can't forget the economic boom they experienced, too.
Oh, yeah, all that manufacturing to keep up with wartime needs, right?
Exactly. That surge in manufacturing really set the stage for how they'd approach the Cold War, gave them a new kind of influence, new challenges.
So they come out of World War II as this, powerhouse, militarily and economically.
Yes, they did.
But then it's a whole new global chess game, the Cold War. So where did Canada land on all that?
Well, firmly in the Western Bloc. They became a founding member of NATO in 1949.
Showing their commitment to the alliance against the Soviet Union.
Exactly. But at the same time, they also really wanted to be seen as peacemakers.
Trying to walk that fine line, eh?
Yeah, exactly. They're trying to balance these Western alliances with wanting to be a force for peace globally. And that's where Lester B. Pearson comes in.
Oh, right, the Canadian diplomat.
Yeah, super important during the 1956 Suez Crisis. He helped create the UN's very first peacekeeping force.
Huge accomplishment. Didn't he win a Nobel Peace Prize for that?
He did, in 1957. So on one hand, they're allied with the U.S., and on the other, they're out there winning peace prizes.
So were they truly independent, or just trying to play both sides?
That's the million-dollar question. Historians are still debating that today. There are these two main camps, realists and liberal internationalists.
Okay, break this down for me.
All right, so the realists, people like Robert Bothwell, they argue that Canada's foreign policy was basically dictated by its reliance on the U.S., economically, strategically.
So in their view, Canada was kind of stuck following the U.S. lead.
Pretty much. Then you have the liberal internationalists like John Holmes.
What's their take?
They focus on Canada's contributions to diplomacy. They think Canada genuinely wanted peace, and the Suez Crisis proved they could act independently.
Skillfully, too, right?
Exactly. But history's rarely black and white. It's probably a bit of both.
A balancing act.
Yeah. And to understand it better, we need to look at how the Cold War was playing out within Canada itself.
Because it wasn't just some far-off thing, right? The Cold War had a presence in Canada.
Oh, yeah.
And isn't that where we get into some spy drama? The Gouzenko Affair, wasn't it?
You got it. In 1945, Igor Gouzenko, the Soviet clerk, he defects to Canada.
And what he revealed really shook things up.
Oh, it was a bombshell.
Wait, so there was a Soviet spy ring operating in Canada?
Right under their noses. Gouzenko walked out of the Soviet embassy in Ottawa with documents that blew the whole thing wide open.
That's wild. I bet that created some serious tension in Canada.
You think? They're trying to be peacemakers on the world stage, and then they discover they have enemies within their own borders.
Talk about a complicated time to be Canadian. Trying to balance these global ambitions with these very real internal threats.
It was definitely a time of contradictions, but to get the full impact of the Gouzenko affair, we need to dig a little deeper.
Let's do it. What exactly did Gouzenko reveal, and how did Canada react to this shocking discovery?
Well, Gouzenko's documents, they name names, Canadians who were secretly working with the Soviets.
Canadians? Wow.
It was a whole network of spies embedded in the government, military, even scientific research.
So many areas. I can only imagine the sense of betrayal.
Oh, it was huge. Based on his testimony, a number of people were arrested, investigated. Some were actually convicted of espionage.
Really?
Yeah. Others were cleared, but the damage was done, reputations tarnished, careers ruined. It really shook people's trust.
That's got to be hard to come back from. And it just shows, these spy dramas, these historical events, they weren't just games. Real people's lives were affected.
Absolutely. And that sense of paranoia, that suspicion, it really fueled Canada's Red Scare. People were worried about communist infiltration, the threat to their democracy.
I can see why. So you've got Canada trying to be these peacemakers on the world stage, but then dealing with this threat at home.
Exactly. And all this happening with the looming threat of nuclear war, too. Remember, as a member of NATO and NORAD, Canada was basically on the front lines.
The target.
A target. It was a defining part of the Cold War era, not just for Canadians, but for everyone. You know, people building bomb shelters, kids practicing drills in school.
It's hard to imagine living with that kind of fear, that nuclear war could just happen.
It permeated everything, international relations, even pop culture.
So how did the Canadian government handle all this? External threats, internal threats, nuclear fears. That's a lot.
It was a balancing act, for sure. They had to reassure citizens, keep things calm, but they also had to strengthen security, protect the country, both from those internal and external threats we were talking about.
Projecting stability while preparing for the worst.
Yeah. It's a tension a lot of countries faced back then. And for Canada, you see it in their role in NATO. They were committed to the alliance, to deterring the Soviets.
But also trying to find ways to promote peace.
Right. And Pearson and the Suez Crisis is a great example of that.
Yeah.
Helping to create that UN peacekeeping force diffused a really tense situation in the Middle East.
And won him a Nobel Prize.
Exactly. So you've got espionage, nuclear fears, and then this balancing act between being a good ally and a peacemaker.
A lot going on. It must have had a huge impact on Canadian society.
Oh, absolutely. It was a time of major shifts, socially, culturally.
In what ways? Was it all doom and gloom?
Well, not all bad. The post-war economic boom, it led to a higher standard of living for a lot of Canadians. Consumer goods were more available, people had more money, there was a sense of optimism.
Opportunity.
A time of progress. But I'm guessing there were downsides too, right?
Of course. The fear of nuclear war, that was constant. And the Red Scare created a lot of suspicion, distrust, worries about communist infiltration, threats to democracy.
Sounds like a very complex, contradictory time. Did it affect their politics?
You bet. All this heightened anxieties about communism, socialism, led to some political polarization.
Interesting.
Right-wing groups, they were suspicious of anyone even a little bit leftist. Left-wing activists were critical of the close relationship with the U.S.
It's amazing how some of those anxieties about communism are still around today, you know? It's true. So you have this growing sense of national identity, pride, but also these internal fears and divisions.
Did they find a way through all that?
They did. You know, the Cold War, even with all its challenges, it actually fostered a sense of unity in Canada. A shared experience helped solidify their national identity. They realized they had to work together to face these threats, build a more secure future.
So the Cold War, in a way, pushed them to define themselves, both at home and on the world stage.
That's a great way to put it. They had to confront their values, their allegiances, figure out who they wanted to be as a nation. And that journey, that adaptation, that's what makes Canada's story so fascinating. It's more than just surviving communism or managing alliances. It's about forging their own path, a Canadian path.
A unique path. It reminds us that history isn't just about the big picture. It's about individual stories, everyday people trying to make sense of the world. But before we get too philosophical, I'm really curious about the lasting impacts of the Cold War on Canada. How did it shape their future?
Well, it had a profound impact, that's for sure. Left behind a legacy that's still visible today. Forced them to confront some tough questions about their role in the world, their relationship with the U.S., the balance between security and freedom. Questions that are still relevant today, actually.
Okay, now you've got me really curious. What kind of legacy are we talking about? How does it still influence Canada today? So what were some of those lasting impacts? How did the Cold War shape Canada's future?
Well, for one, it really had a big impact on their military and defense policies. I mean, the Cold War basically pushed Canada to develop a much stronger military, even their intelligence stuff.
Yeah, they had to be ready for that potential conflict with the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Makes sense. But was there a downside to all that military buildup?
It did raise concerns about, that balance between national security and civil liberties. Remember the Gouzenko Affair? The Red Scare?
Right, all that suspicion.
Exactly. It created this atmosphere where people were really distrustful. And in some cases, the government went too far trying to find communists. They actually violated some people's civil liberties.
It's that classic dilemma, right? Security versus freedom. We still struggle with that today, especially with terrorism and stuff.
Oh, absolutely. It's a debate that came straight out of the Cold War, and it forced Canada to really think about the limits of government power, how important it is to protect individual rights. So it's military buildup and debates about civil liberties, but what about the impact on Canadian society more broadly? What other lasting impacts did the Cold War have?
That's a good question. I mean, we can't forget about the economic side of things, can we?
No, we can't. In many ways, the Cold War really fueled Canada's economic boom after the war. You know, military spending created jobs, and all those technological advances during that time, they actually ended up boosting other industries too.
So even with all that global tension, the Cold War actually had some positive economic effects for Canada.
Yeah. It's not all doom and gloom, but we have to remember, the growth wasn't equal for everyone. Some areas benefited a lot more than others.
Right. Everyone wasn't winning.
Exactly. And there were concerns even then about Canada becoming too dependent on the U.S. economically.
Ah, there it is again, that push and pull with the U.S. wanting that independence.
It's a theme that goes all the way back to the Cold War, for sure. And you can still see it in their politics, foreign policy today.
It's fascinating how these historical patterns keep repeating. So we've got the military, the economy, and this ongoing dance with the U.S. Anything else? Any other Cold War legacies we see in Canada today?
Well, one of the biggest ones, I think, is how much Canadians value peace and diplomacy. I mean, their experience in the Cold War, especially those peacekeeping missions, it really made them known as a nation that wants to solve conflicts peacefully.
Which makes sense. They saw firsthand how awful war can be, how important it is to find other solutions.
Exactly. And that commitment to diplomacy, to working with other countries, it's a big part of their foreign policy even now.
It's actually kind of a powerful legacy when you think about it. They took a period of global tension and turned it into a source of national pride.
It's true. And it's a reminder that even the most difficult times can have some unexpected, positive outcomes. Who knew, right?
It's amazing how much we've covered. From spy rings and nuclear fears to economic booms and, Canada becoming this global peacemaker. It's been a really interesting look at a part of history we don't always hear about.
I agree. Canada's experience in the Cold War, it gives us a lot to think about. International relations, the balance between national interests and global responsibility.
And how important those democratic values are in a world that never stops changing.
Exactly. It's never a straight line.
Before we finish up, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier. The human cost of all this. It's easy to get lost in the big picture, the politics, the strategies.
Right.
But we have to remember, real people lived through this. They experienced it all firsthand.
It's so important to remember that. Behind every headline, every policy decision, there are families who are afraid of nuclear war, communities torn apart by suspicion and distrust, people whose lives were changed forever.
It wasn't just a game. And those stories, those experiences, we can't forget them. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Canada and the Cold War, let's take a minute to acknowledge those personal stories, the everyday Canadians who lived through it all.
Absolutely. They showed so much courage, resilience. They never gave up hope for a better future. Their stories are a part of history, too.
So well said. It's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you to all our listeners for joining us. We hope you learned something new, thought about things a little differently.
It's been great talking about all this.
And if you want to go even deeper into this, check out the Mr. Hutchings History podcast. They did a fantastic episode on Canada and the Cold War with even more detail. Definitely worth a listen.
It's a great resource, for sure.
Yeah.
Lots of good information in there.
Before we go, one last thought-provoking question for our listeners. Imagine you're a Canadian citizen in the middle of the Cold War. You've seen how much your country has changed, seen those global tensions rise, felt that fear of nuclear war. What side would you be on? Would you focus on that security of the Western alliance, stand with the U.S., or would you push for a more independent path, put peace and diplomacy first?
That's a tough one.
It is. It's a complex question without an easy answer, but it's worth thinking about. It makes us think about what people were facing back then, the choices they had to make.
It reminds us that history isn't just about facts and figures. It's a story about people, their struggles, their triumphs, choices they had to make.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Canada's Cold War. We hope you found it informative, engaging, maybe even a little challenging.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep that conversation going.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.